Hello, everyone, and welcome to another video on our own devices. I'm Jean Messier, and today we are diving back into the wonderful world of Polaroid cameras. Specifically, we're going to be looking at four of the very last cameras that the Polaroid Corporation produced before filing for bankruptcy. Now, if you want to learn more about how Polaroid instant cameras work and a bit more about the rise and fall of the corporation, please check out my three-part video series on the subject, link in description. But in brief, the downfall of Polaroid began in 1977 with the release of Polavision, an instant home movie format. Now, while Polavision was very innovative, unfortunately, it had quite a number of flaws in its execution that made it less flexible and less attractive than conventional 8mm home movie formats. Also, it was the victim of poor timing, being released at around the same time as home video formats like Betamax and VHS were being released onto the market. But while Polavision damaged Polaroid as a company, what really did them in was complacency. You see, just like their rival Kodak, Polaroid had been doing so well using the same business model for so long that they failed to adapt to a rapidly changing market. This is what's known as a success trap. Indeed, Polaroid was one of the first companies to acknowledge the potential of digital photography. But rather than exploring the possibilities of editing and sharing photos on screens, they instead tried to develop a compact photo printer in order to reproduce the classic Polaroid film experience digitally. They're also facing increasing competition from cheap point-and-shoot 35mm cameras and one-hour photo labs, which really cut into the convenience factor that had been Polaroid bread and butter for so many years. And in response to this market, Polaroid's reaction was to create a bunch of very cheap cameras in order to raise its profit margins. And that is what we are going to be looking at today. Right, so the first camera we're going to have a look at today is the Captiva or Captiva SLR, also known as the Vision. This was produced between 1993 and 1997 and was designed to use a new integral film format known as Captiva or Series 500 film, which took 73 by 54mm or 2.8 by 2.1 inch exposures, had an ISO of 600 and 10 exposures per film pack. Now, this camera is unusual in being a folding single lens reflex or SLR design that is distinct from the classic Polaroid folding SLRs like the SX70. Indeed, on the outside, this looks like a regular 35mm point and shoot, albeit a very chunky one. But this isn't actually the configuration that this is intended to be used in. Instead, you press down on this button above the flash, and this front panel flips up, and the lens folds out 90 degrees relative to the film and locks in place. And you can see the flexible vinyl bellows on the side that allow the folding to take place. And to load the film, you press on this latch at the back, and the rear compartment opens up just a little. It doesn't flip all the way open as in previous Polaroid designs. And this allows you to slide in your 500 series film pack. Now, if you have one of these and you want to shoot it, unfortunately, 500 series film was discontinued in 2004. And as far as I know, nobody makes any reproductions. So you have to use original film, which by this point is at least 20 years old and almost all expired and useless. So unfortunately, these are not very convenient to shoot at all. Now, in terms of external features and controls, this is really quite a simple camera. We have a 107mm f12 3-element plastic lens with an electronic shutter automatically adjustable between 1/180th of a second and 1/4 of a second. At the back, we have our electronic shutter release, a slider to adjust the exposure if an image comes out too bright or dark, and another slider that activates a 12-second self-timer. We also have an exposure counter window and a viewfinder, which, being an SLR, presents a direct view through the lens via an internal 45-degree mirror. So the focusing system on the Captiva is automatic, but unlike a lot of other Polaroid cameras from this period, it doesn't use the ultrasonic-based sonar system for range finding. Rather, it uses an alternative system known as a wink, which briefly activates the flash just prior to taking an exposure. And the photocell will measure the amount of light reflected back by the subject and automatically adjust the focus. Now, if the system detects a subject that is less than 2.7 meters or around 8.5 feet away, it will insert a close-up lens into the lens assembly. And finally, one of the most distinctive features of the Captiva, other than its folding SLR mechanism, is this film compartment in the back into which the exposed film is ejected. And the idea behind this allows you to take multiple exposures in quick succession without having to worry about extracting each one individually. Though, since the focusing mechanism requires the flash to be fully charged before an exposure is taken, in quick succession is a relative term. Unfortunately, however, this mechanism requires the film to make a full 180-degree turn before entering the compartment. This is very prone to jamming. Indeed, when you find these cameras in flea markets and thrift stores, you'll often find an exposure jammed inside the mechanism, which was the reason that the original owner abandoned the camera. Now, in addition to the regular version, there was also a special edition or SE version of the Captiva produced, which was largely identical to the original version, but had a glass lens assembly and a date and timestamp feature for the film. And Polaroid also made a clip-on macro lens that fit on both versions. Now, unfortunately, the Captiva was not very popular, mainly due to the larger market forces that were plaguing Polaroid at the time. But also, compared to other Polaroid cameras like the SX70 series or the Spectra, this was just as bulky and expensive, but produced smaller format photographs. There wasn't much of a demand for this type of camera. Right, so the next camera we're going to have a look at is the Polaroid PopShots, which was released in 1999 and was the world's first disposable instant camera, designed to compete with the disposable 35mm cameras then gaining in popularity. And just like the Captiva, this uses Series 500 film, only it is sealed inside the camera body and cannot be replaced. Now, these came individually sealed in a plastic bag like this one, which contained the camera, a plastic cover to prevent the shutter button from being accidentally activated in storage, a set of colorful cardboard frames, and a pre-addressed, prepaid USPS mailer. And the idea was, once the camera was empty, you would put it in the mailer and mail it back to Polaroid, who would refill it with film and resell it. And in return, you would receive a $4 coupon off your next Polaroid camera purchase. Now, that was in North America. In Europe, you are advised to take your empty camera back to the nearest dealer, and Polaroid would then make a donation to one of several charities, including to AIDS research. Now, as you can imagine, for a disposable camera, this is really quite a simple design. We have, again, a 107mm lens. We have an electronic flash with a photocell. We have a small slider which switches between indoor and outdoor mode. And this does two things. Number one, it activates the flash for indoor mode. And it also slides a set of water-house diaphragms in front of the lens to vary the aperture. We have our electronic shutter release button. We have a direct viewfinder in the back here. And we have an exposure counter. Now, while the flash is powered by the Polapulse battery integrated into the film pack, for cost-saving reasons, this doesn't have automatic film ejection. Rather, after you've taken an exposure, you pull on this ring, which activates a rack and pinion mechanism and ejects the photograph. Now, unfortunately, this example is over 20 years old, and the film in it is completely expired. I've tried taking a couple of photographs with it, but yeah, no, this does not work whatsoever. Otherwise, however, this is a very slick and well-designed little camera, which theoretically should have been able to compete against 35mm disposable cameras. Unfortunately, however, when this was released, it cost $20, or around $37 today, which, while considerably cheaper than a reloadable Polaroid camera, especially if you just want to take a couple of snapshots while you're on vacation, is far more expensive than a 35mm disposable camera. And most consumers decided that the added convenience was not worth the added price. Right, so moving on, the next camera we have here is the JoyCam, which was also introduced in 1999 and was basically a reloadable version of the PopShots. So if we look on the outside here, this is basically identical in configuration to the PopShots. We have an electronic flash with a photocell, we have a direct viewfinder, we have a slider for indoor and outdoor mode, a flash charge indicator lamp, a mechanical shutter release button, an exposure counter, and a ring pull film ejector. Other than the styling, about the only difference between this and the PopShots is the rear film compartment, which opens like this. And again, this takes 500 series film. And if we look closer inside, we can see a number of design details, including the capacitor for the flash system, and also these very sharp corrugated panels in and around the lens. And these are to diffuse any stray light coming into the lens and prevent it from interfering with the exposure. Now, the thing that I noticed the most about this particular camera is how cheaply it's constructed. Indeed, the rear film compartment door doesn't even have a mechanical hinge. It hinges on this big sticker that holds the instructions. And I would imagine that if you use this camera enough times, this is eventually going to wear through and tear, and you're going to have a loose rear door, which is not great for a camera. What's even weirder is that this is of inferior construction even to the PopShots, despite the latter being a disposable camera. This really shows how desperate Polaroid was during this period. They were really cranking out some cheap products in order to try to raise their profit margins. And finally, the last camera we're going to look at today is one of the very last that Polaroid ever marketed. This is the iZone, introduced in 1999. And I'm actually old enough to remember when these came out. They were very popular. A lot of my friends had them, though I don't think I ever owned one myself. Now, this was designed to take a new film format called pocket film, which took 24 by 36 millimeters or 1 by 1.5 inch exposures, around the same as a 35 millimeter negative, and were marketed mainly at kids and teenagers. And indeed, camera bodies themselves came in a number of colorful designs, while the film had a colorful border that could be trimmed after development. It also had an adhesive backing so it could be stuck to your bedroom wall, your school locker door, things like that. Now, just like the PopShots and the JoyCam, this has a very simple control layout. We have an electronic flash, which stays on all the time. It cannot be deactivated. But unlike previous integral film formats, pocket film didn't have an integral battery. So this camera had to be loaded with two AA batteries to power the flash. There's also a direct viewfinder, though strangely there doesn't seem to be any sort of exposure counter window. Now we have a mechanical shutter release, and arranged around it is our exposure control, which has 4 different settings: indoor, outdoor full sunlight, outdoor cloudy, and off. And no matter which of these positions you move it to, when you take an exposure, it automatically resets back to off, which removes all of the diaphragms from in front of the lens. Now, if we push this button on the side, we can hinge open the film compartment. You can see where the film cartridge would have loaded. You can also see that, like on many Polaroid cameras, the film plane is mounted 90 degrees to the lens, and there's a little 45-degree mirror in there to reflect the image from the lens onto the film. Now, just like the 2 previous cameras that we looked at, this doesn't have automatic ejection. Rather, you would actually pull the end of an exposed piece of film and pull it out through the rollers. And this is identical to the pack film introduced by Polaroid all the way back in 1962. So this is a bit of a full circle moment for this particular technology. Now, the iZone actually proved very popular, especially among the youth it was mainly marketed towards, being the best-selling camera of 1999-2000. Unfortunately for Polaroid, though, this ended up being too little, too late, and they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy the very next year. Anyway, that's all I have for you today, and this forms the unofficial 4th part of my series on Polaroid cameras. Though, as I've said before, if I come across any other interesting Polaroid variants, I will definitely feature them in their own separate videos. Now, as I said in my previous video, I apologize for not publishing very much during this month. As I said, I've been very busy with the Winnipeg Fringe Theatre Festival, but hopefully in August I will get back to my regular release schedule. Until then, thank you so much for watching. I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.